I am going to talk to you about Great Dixter, which is a garden in East Sussex. It's 10 miles or 15 kilometers from the sea, and it has this historic house in the center of a 6-acre garden. The garden has got estate land all around it, and the estate land is about 70 acres of woodland, of meadowland, of pasture land. The garden itself is quite wild, as you can see. It has topiary pieces, it has ornamental plants, different types of roses, different types of perennials, mixed in with the wild plants of the area. It's a very ornamental, highly ornamental garden, which is full of flowers over a long season, and it is open to the public. We get about 50,000 visitors a year. We're open from April right the way through till October, and we shut our gates for the winter so that we can redo the garden and take a rest from the open season. It's a garden that changes through the seasons, so you can see it goes from something like that to that, and in the winter it will look like that, because we don't cut down everything too early, we let it stand for the winter. As I said, it's a place that's very wild. You can see the seats are full of plants that have self-sown into the cracks. The walls are full of plants that come and go. This is a wall that's near the back of the house, and you can see that this is the spring season with euphorbias and primulas and aubrietia, and that same wall 5 weeks later does that as it changes. So it's very, very dynamic. So if you look at the walls of Great Dixter, the walls can start like this, and then they can change into that, and then go into that in the autumn, which is what this wall looks like now as we are in the autumn season. The whole place has got a formal backbone of hedges, of topiary pieces, of buildings, and is full of colorful plants, but is also full of plants that self-sow throughout the whole estate. So you can see how informal it is with all the self-sowers. As well as that, it's got many meadow habitats that come right into the garden. These habitats vary from one place to another, and they are rich in all sorts of wildflowers, including some of Britain's rarest wildflowers, like these terrestrial orchids. And that, again, is a strange mix in a formal setting where you have things like topiary pieces and meadows alongside the topiary. So if you move from the meadows to close to the house, you can see that the walls are covered in vegetation. The steps are covered in vegetation. The terrace is covered in vegetation. And this vegetation changes from this to this just in a few weeks as certain things finish flowering and other things come and take over. The edges of the paths and the walkways are informal like this, with plants spilling onto the edge. And even our nursery areas, our stock beds where we grow our plants for the nursery, because Great Dixter produces about 90,000 plants for sale every year, and the plants are generated from these areas. Even these areas will have the informal effect of plants that are self-sowing through them. So this space that you can see in May looks like this in July. It's the same area. That changes to that. So you can see that the garden is very dynamic. And if I take you to a general view of the garden, you can see that this is early on with alliums in flower. Then the alliums finish, and it changes to that. And then the hesperus finishes, and it does that. And then it develops to that, which is what it looks like now. You know, this is what it looked like yesterday. So, and if you break that down to individual spaces, you may have a space that's full of crocuses and galanthus, and that same space just in a few weeks, does that with the prunus that comes up and flowers. And then as the prunus finishes, the cornflowers come up and take over that space. So you can see that not only is the garden very dynamic in the way it changes, but each pocket has a layer of plants, so it's very multi-layered. So if you look at something like the long border, this is in May, into June, into July, into August. You can see how colorful it is. Into September, and then October, and then over the winter, it all goes brown. So you can see that there is color right through the season as the borders change. And this is good for visitation. So when the visitors come, there's always something exciting for them to see. So it mimics what happens in our meadow areas. So we will have crocuses first, followed by fritillaries, followed by orchids in the same space. So the borders are mimicking what happens in nature. As well as that, as well as these multi-layered communities, we play around a lot with annual plants, plants that produce their life cycle in 1 year. And these are the sort of the colorful displays that we get from Dixter. And that mimics what happens in a cornfield, as you can see there. This is on the edges of Lake Balaton in Hungary, and you can see that it's full of colorful plants. And if you go to Dixter, that same level of annual colorful display happens throughout the garden. And you can see how that happens. So tulips first amongst digitalis. Then the digitalis flowers. And once the digitalis flowers, it's removed, and that display follows. So I'm going to now show you a series of those displays that we've done over 30 years, and where we've never ever replicated anything, and we've always grown the plants ourselves. So if you look at tulips first, digitalis next, and then after the digitalis, cannas, helichrysum, rudbeckias, dahlias follow. That's 1 year. In another year, tulips, Hatsazakura tulips amongst myosotis, followed by antherinums, followed by salvias and dahlias and erigeron annuus and cosmos. And in another year, tulips and myosotis, this is all in the same place, followed by clarkias, buplorums, silenums, tanasetums. And once that finishes, that's the display that follows. Okay, so again, another example. Tulips and myosotis, very simple display. Followed by silene, buplorum, cynoglossum, and tanasetum. Then, which is then followed by zinnias that are sown late. And then another display will follow this. So last year, the display was this. Now, every single plant there was produced by us. In fact, like I said, other than the bulbs that are bought on an annual basis, every single plant is produced by us. So we're training the gardeners to sow the seed, to take cuttings, to get the timing right, so that you can see that it's a highly cultivated ornamental garden, which looks like this in the spring season, and that develops. And then you've got tulips that adorn all the borders, like you can see there, and you can see there. And the scene changes throughout the year. So you go from this in the spring, to that in early summer, to that in midsummer, and then this at the end of the summer, all in 1 year, all in one place, with a mixture of plantings, so you can see an extremely long season out of these plants. As well as this, as well as the color, we play around with foliage, with tropical plants and subtropical plants to create a scene like that in our tropical jungle. As well as this, we play around with our meadow areas by introducing bulbs into the long grass so that we can have irises amongst our long grass. So the whole place is colourful, dynamic, but full of wildlife as a result of this wild element that comes into that place. So, in essence, Great Dixter is a sensitively but highly managed flower garden open to the public. We're colourful, dynamic, dramatic, full of non-native plants and gardens. But gardens like us, large or small, are sometimes labelled as unnatural and all things bad associated with old-fashioned gardening. So everyone, ecologists especially, expected the wildlife value at Great Dixter to be low compared to the countryside beyond. But I thought differently, because these are the sort of things that we would see in that garden on a regular basis. From newts, to badgers, to woodpeckers, to lots of butterflies, to spiders. So what I did is when Christopher Lloyd died in 2007, I stopped spraying chemicals. We used organic fertilizer instead of inorganic fertilizer. And we used less fertilizer, reducing it by 95%. We stopped using peat. We watered less. We developed more sealed units of multi-layered planting. We bedded out with annuals less and allowed the outside edges to grow to encourage the vegetation to billow out. So the place became even more charming. So the outside of the garden became like that. The car parks became like that. And the inside of the garden became like that before all the colourful plants came. And as well as that, we started to create meadows, long grass habitats through the outside of the garden. We started to play around with our woodlands by cutting them down and letting them grow again to develop a mosaic habitat in them to allow light to come in to these areas. To allow light to come into these areas, to have different amounts of insects and different amounts of vegetation in these areas. And the wood we harvested from these areas, we used in making hurdles, we used in making charcoal, we used to make benches, we used to make posts and fence posts throughout the garden. So it became a circular system that we would use the materials from our wood, but also we would open up the wood so that we would allow more light to come in to increase biodiversity. And the wood really, flourished amongst that. So this is our woodlands with bluebells flowering all the way underneath it. And then we had a woodland management scheme, which is a very interesting scheme where we cut things at different ages of their life. Some trees are allowed to get to 100 years old. Some trees are allowed to get to 40 years old. Some trees are cut when they're 15, 20 years old, so that you have a rotation, which means that you have a mosaic system in our woodlands. And then I thought, if the mosaic system in our woodlands creates greater biodiversity, why don't we have a mosaic system in our grasslands? So we started to cut the grass at different levels. So we had different level cutting management systems for meadow habitats. Some long grass meadows that were left for 2-3 years. Some areas cut once a year. Some areas were cut twice a year. Some areas were cut 5 times a year, and some areas were cut 8 times a year, which gave us that diversity of habitats which encouraged biodiversity. As well as that, we started to graze with sheep as well, and with cattle, because sheep, cattle, horses all graze differently, and that gives you a different element of grassland, which gives you diversity in your biodiversity. So, and you can see on the bottom right that we got a moth trap to look at the moths at night, and then we would discover these sort of moths at night that were there, just terrific things that looked like butterflies, even more colorful than butterflies, but they were our visitors at night. So enthused about this, about the wildlife that was at At Dixter, I wrote to the British Arachnological Society, who do the studies on in spiders in the United Kingdom, but they wrote back and said that they were reluctant to come to a garden because they thought gardens were sterile spaces, that they wouldn't find much wildlife. So I asked them to come, to use the house free of charge for their meetings, that we would feed them, we would give them drink. So they came. And when they came, they went out and to have some fresh air in the garden, and they found a spider under this metal clasp here by the gate that had only been recorded 3 times in the United Kingdom. Down the path, they found a spider that hadn't been recorded in Sussex since 1920. And before I knew it, we were in the front page of the British Arachnological Society magazine, with 7 pages dedicated to us, with over 77 species of spider that they'd found in that one visit. As well as finding an interesting rare spider, they found a very interesting rare beetle on this bit of wood, in this wood pile, which then caused me to stop burning our wood, any spare wood we had, and we started making these insect hotels and these habitat piles. Whilst I was doing this, my wife, who is a scientist, said to me, get a biodiversity audit done, because you're creating new meadow habitats, you're creating wood piles, you're doing a number of things, but you don't know why you're doing this. It's much better that you know what's there and what should be there so that you can have direction in the habitat creation that you're doing. Because there is this thing called the web of life that connects everything together. So I got a grant and invited all the scientists in. And this is just a few examples of what we looked at. We looked at mosses, liverworts, we looked at insects of all sorts, flies, dragonflies, bees, spiders, we looked at mammals and reptiles, we looked at all the vascular plants in the woodlands, we looked at the whole thing over 1 year. And there were very interesting people who came, people who were looking at lichens and those sort of things. And in 1 year, in that small space, there were over 2,400 species recorded in 1 year from a handful of visits. There were over 110 species of lichen. There were over 110 species of bee out of a total of 230 species in the United Kingdom. There were several species of principal importance, nationally endangered species, nationally rare and nationally scarce species. There were 17 species of bumblebee out of the total of 24 in the United Kingdom. There were over 400 species of moth. There were 32 species of butterfly out of 59 total in the United Kingdom. And there were over 280 species of spider out of a total of 650. And we were told this survey was incredible because it was only for 1 year. The numbers were incredible. And if we survey more, the numbers will go up. Rare species were easily found, which means that they were common. And our lead ecologist, Andy Phillips, said Great Dixter is an eye-opener and it has changed the way he thinks about gardens. He now calls us a garden nature reserve and thinks we could be designated a local nature reserve or local wildlife site. So this was unexpected, especially within the ecological community where there can be a prejudice against a traditional garden like ours. Okay, so, and why was Dixter rich? Dixter was rich because there was a variety of habitats, from wet, dry, sunny, shady, to mosaic woodland, to mosaic grassland, and so on. There was a variety of habitats. Dixter was also rich in biodiversity because there was a long season of food, a long season of pollen and nectar-rich resources. And it's not just native plants, it's exotics and natives together. Dixter was also rich because there was no spraying for the last 16, 17, 18 years. Dixter was also rich because there's a diversity of practices, from digging to habitats, areas that are dug to habitats that are left undisturbed. And Dixter was also rich because of the variety of plants that we had in there. And also Dixter is rich because the web feeds itself. The more there is, the more there will be. And we were also rich as a result of the creativity of the gardeners within that garden and the years of activity within that place. So an intensively managed garden with ecological practices can be a haven for wildlife, and Great Dixter proves this. Great Dixter is a large garden, but small gardens can add up to be significant, and so can urban spaces, rooftops, parks, pavements, cracks, walls. Every space can play a part. Wildlife will and can adapt and don't necessarily need to rewild to do this. Okay, it's about blurring the edges between horticulture and ecology. And if you think about it, in the United Kingdom, there are 433,000 hectares of garden. There are approximately 240,000 hectares of roadside verge. There's 1.7 million hectares of urban area, and all of it is out of the food production zone, and all of it within our control. So if you look at Great Dixter on the top left, it's no different in many ways to the villages that are around us, to the local town, and even a city can have the greenery that's in there. And if you look at people's back gardens, that creates an incredible mosaic, as you can see there. So why not have our roads and our towns and cities looking like this? But to understand what we were doing, we decided to produce a biodiversity heat map. To look at all the parts of Dixter, from the formal gardens to the orchard to the pond areas, all of it, to have a look at it. And it was very interesting because we thought the ancient woodlands, the old woodlands, will be rich in wildlife, and they were. We thought the grasslands with the orchids would be rich in wildlife, and they were. We thought the pasture land with the grazing land would be rich in wildlife, and it was. But the richest part of the whole place, the whole estate, was the garden itself, with this sunken garden being the richest part of the whole area. And you can see why that is, because if you look at the sunken garden and look at the countryside around it, you can see how complex that garden is in terms of vegetation, in terms of habitat, in terms of structures, and that's what gives us diversity. Okay, so we then did all of that, and then we looked at all the different things. And the Culeates, for instance, the highest numbers were in the formal gardens. The Diptera, the highest numbers were in the formal gardens. The Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, the highest number was in the formal gardens. The Hemiptera, the true bugs, the highest numbers were in the formal gardens. The Odonata, the formal gardens, and the parasitoid wasps, the formal gardens. And then if you look at the insects, the species of insects that were found, the whole estate, 1,185 insects in 1 year, and 516 were in the garden, which is small compared to the woodlands. So you can see how rich the garden was. In fact, when you look at species per meter square, Great Dixter Garden has been on the table of everything that's been recorded in the United Kingdom. It's in the top 5 richest places of all the places that have had audits done in the United Kingdom. So the garden is extremely, extremely rich. We thought these meadow areas with the orchids would be rich, but these areas were also rich as the meadow areas. So when we looked at our success was down to growing wild plants next to garden plants. Our success was down to having really diverse variety of plants in the place. Our success was down to not cutting down and tidying up prematurely, doing that slowly over a long period. Our success was down to growing Apiaceae and alliums and those sort of things that actually support a wide range of insects. So we grow a large number of these. Our success was down to concentrated areas of vegetation that come one after another, like the meadow areas. So the crocuses and the prunus and the centuria follow each other in that same space in a year. So there's a density of vegetation. Our success was down to having the diversity the long grass next to the short grass, the paved areas, the highly colourful organised borders, the buildings, and everything all together in close proximity. Exactly what you can do in a town and city. Our success was down to having our walls clothed in vegetation. So all the bees and all the things that live in there have got the food just outside of their doorstep. Our success was also down to allowing things to burrow in the cracks in the paving. Our success was also down to allowing, things to make homes in the brickwork and in the wood. The house is still stable, but there are little nooks and crannies for the insects to live. And there are little nooks and crannies in the old wood, in the old fence posts, in the old trees. So these are not tidied up. And also, the garden in the winter has a lot of debris or detritus. And our success was down to that as well, because that provides another habitat. So all in all, these sort of areas and our creativity stretch the amount of biodiversity we would have in these places. And if you look at this pile of wood, there, this is the life associated with it. And you can see how that affects different parts of the garden. So all of it works together. And our success was also down to those mosaic habitats of grassland, some areas that are cut regularly and provide a flowering hiccup. Some areas that are cut really low down and then allowed to grow. To that, followed by that, followed by that, followed by that, and then it's allowed to go brown, and then it's cut again. And that allows us to get the diversity of orchids and those sort of things in those areas. And the whole place is charming and beautiful and atmospheric, and it has all of this color, and along with that comes all of these insects that are there. So ecologists in the United Kingdom have considered gardens and design landscapes to be a part of the problem, but are now realizing that we can be a part of the solution. Gardens, large or small, in the countryside, urban or suburban, whether they are public or private, along with roadside verges, urban areas, brownfield sites, and so on, together will add up to something effective. This, along with protecting the countryside and farming in a sensitive way, will make a huge difference to biodiversity. So it's really great that Laura Gatti is doing Bosco Verticali. It's really great that NEP is rewilding its farmland. It's great that there are things like the Grass Roof Company with John Little doing those sort of things, but gardens can play a part as well. And we can bring gardens to the inner city, as we've done in Nigel Dunnett and Zach Tudor have done to the Grey to Green scheme in Sheffield, where they've taken a grey area like this, and then they've turned it into that. And with a sud system, with low maintenance, low water use, that's greened up the city. So why are we still producing these sort of things when we've got all of this information available to us to make cities livable? Why are we producing walls like this, whereas we could be producing more walls like that and that, or seats like that? So every little bit would help, from bricks that allow bees to nest, to sand piles that allow bees to nest in there, to swallow houses, to bat houses, and so on, and green roofs. All of it will help. Even something like just water and a log pile will make a difference. And what's happening is that you're taking these habitats, the horse no longer grazes there, and the old man no longer plays tennis, so he handed this bit of ground over to us to develop a garden. He was interested in the gardens of the Silk Route, and then we developed that in 1.5 years from that site to that. And this is now, the biodiversity in this area has gone sky high as a result of this garden being formed. And with care and attention, we can create habitats like this. But it's really important because knowledge is key so that we can act in the right way. And that's why at Great Dixter, we work alongside an ecologist and an entomologist so that we understand exactly what our actions are leading to. And from that, we can then start educating. We can then start educating the public as well. Whether it's about soil, whether it's about the soil food web, whether it's at the web of life, it's all about passing that way of thinking to the next generation of gardeners and the next generation of green workers. So what makes Great Dixter rich is relevant to any design landscape or any garden. The mosaic system within Dixter, in many ways, can be replicated in any village, town, or city. It just needs politicians, ecologists, town planners, councils, builders, landscapers, architects, landscape architects, volunteer groups, gardeners, and private individuals to have the will to work together. And it's about giving the visionaries the power to make things happen. It's about bringing wildlife in at every opportunity, and gardeners can play their part, and everyone will bring a different element. That doesn't mean your garden has to be totally wild. It means that if you're gardening in a sensitive way, without chemicals, you can really make a difference. And that's what happens at Dixter. So here is a garden that is being gardened in a sensitive way, that embraces wildlife, but it's also a garden that is highly colorful, that has a long season of interest, that's gardened by humans so that we grow things, we take things out, we put new things in. It's not allowed to go completely wild, although there is wild areas around and in the garden, but it's a highly colorful garden that gives people joy. And that's really important. Color gives people joy, and it brings them closer to nature, and from there, perhaps, they will start seeing the beauty of your local and your native plants, especially in this country, because the flora of Turkey is so exciting that we should be using more and more of those plants in our landscaping work. So you can create a garden that's joyous and colorful while still embracing the wildlife that was there before you created a garden, so that you can live in harmony with these two things together and share the same space together. And so much will improve within your garden. Because if you look at Dixter, we haven't used chemicals since 2007. We don't have to even think about spraying because there is a balance. If something bad comes, something good comes and eats that. And the balance has been there for all of those years, so we can garden harmoniously with all of these things. Thank you very much. Thank you.